By sunrise in 1895, just outside Coos Bay, Oregon, the sawmill foreman found something that none of the men who came after him could make sense of. The morning was cold. Salt air hung thick off the bay, and the coastal fog had only begun to thin. The wedge and line crew, 5 men who worked the timber flats by the water, had gone out before first light as they always did, and by the time the cook rang the bell for breakfast, 4 of them had come back through the gate. The 5th had not. His name was Edward Kess. He was 38 years old, a lean man with scarred hands and a reputation that moved slow and steady. Not the type to vanish into routine labor, not the type to panic. Men in Coos Bay, Oregon, still speak of him the way old hands speak of someone you could trust to walk into the dark alone and come back the same. He had a wife in a small house 3 miles south, along the mill road. Catherine. She had a daughter from a first marriage, and Edward had taken to the girl like she was his own blood. On the morning he went out, Catherine had pressed a cloth of bread and salt meat into his hands before he left in the dark. He had kissed the daughter on the top of her head while she still slept. He never came back to eat it. The foreman's name was Merrick. He was the one who noticed first that Edward wasn't among the crew stepping back through the timber gate into the mill yard. Merrick had eyes that counted things without thinking. He counted heads the way a shepherd counts sheep. 4 heads, 1 missing. "Where's Kess?" Merrick had called out to the crew. The men looked at each other. One of them, a hand named Garrett, shook his head. He said he was going to check the wedges on the north line. Said the salt spray had loosened them. He said he'd be back within the hour. That was at 6:20 in the morning. The fog had been thick then, rolling in off the bay in sheets so heavy a man could barely see his own boots. Edward had walked out into it without hesitation. He knew those timber flats. He had walked them in worse weather than this. By 7 o'clock, when Edward still hadn't returned, Merrick walked out himself into that same fog. The ground was soft from the salt mist and the night rain. His own boot prints sank clean into the mud, and there, just past the cook fire where the crew had stood warming their hands before going to work, Merrick found Edward's boot prints. But they were all turned backward. Every print was heel first, as if Edward had been walking in reverse the entire way, looking back over his shoulder at the camp, or looking at something that no one else could see. The prints formed a wide circle around the cook fire, slow and deliberate, as if Edward had been thinking about something, turning it over in his mind. Then the prints straightened out and headed toward the open ground north of the camp, away from the timber line, away from the gate, away from any place a man would reasonably walk. And then they stopped. Just stopped. There was no sign of Edward anywhere past that point. No body, no blood, no sign of struggle. Only the open ground, the thin grass beaten down by so many boots over so many mornings, and nothing else. What Merrick found at the cook fire was worse. Edward's axe was leaning against a stump where the crew kept their tools. It was wiped clean, completely clean. Not a fleck of bark dust, not a speck of mud, not a smear of sap. In a place where everything carried the grit and salt air of coastal work, Edward's axe looked like it had been polished with cloth just moments before. Merrick stood there and did not move. The fog rolled in thicker and the other men came looking for him. When they saw the circle of backward boot prints, when they saw the prints that ended in nothing, when they saw the clean axe leaning against the stump, they began to back away slowly. "Fetch Catherine," Merrick said quietly, "and bring lanterns. Bring all of them." By the time Catherine Kess arrived at the mill, she was already aware that something had broken in the world. The wives knew. They always knew. A woman married to a working man learns to read the shape of silence in the yard when something has gone wrong. Catherine came with her daughter and with the girl's shawl wrapped around both of them, and she did not cry. Not then. She stood at the edge of the cook fire and looked at her husband's backward footprints and at his clean axe, and she said only one thing: "Bring him back." But there was nowhere to search. That was the beginning of the fear. The older hands in Coos Bay, Oregon, began telling the younger men something then, in voices low enough that it felt like advice from a grave. You don't go out to check those lines alone when the fog rolls in off the bay. You don't go alone in the dark. If you hear something that sounds like Edward Kess calling from past the timber line, you don't answer it. You keep your voice in your chest, and you walk faster. These were not suggestions. These were rules that had always been there, waiting. By the time the search crew assembled and walked out past those backward boot prints with their own lanterns held high, the fog had already covered the ground where Edward's prints had stopped. The earth there was smooth and undisturbed, as if nothing had ever stood on it at all. As if Edward had been lifted straight up into the gray air and dissolved like salt dissolves in water. The crew searched until dark. Then they stopped. Not because they were tired, because none of them wanted to be standing on that open ground when the sun went down and the fog came in again, thick and wet and full of sounds that no one wanted to hear, echoing back from the direction Edward had walked. His wife kept the cloth of bread and salt meat he had never eaten. She kept it in a box in the back room where the light didn't reach. And sometimes the older women in Coos, Oregon, spoke in low voices about how Catherine would sit in that room in the afternoon, just sitting, holding the box, and how sometimes, on the nights when the fog rolled in off the bay and the wind was coming cold from the north, neighbors walking past her house said they could hear the sound of backward footsteps in the dirt, circling slow and steady, around and around, as if something was looking for a place to stop. But it never did stop, not then, not now. The timeline of what happened to Edward Kess began to unravel the moment the men started asking questions instead of just walking in circles with lanterns. What they found made none of them feel better. Garrett, the hand who had last seen Edward that morning, sat on a bench outside the mill office and told Merrick and 3 other men exactly what had happened. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "We went out at 5:30, Garrett said. "That was normal. That was always the time. The fog was down thick, but we could see the fence line clear enough. We split into 2 groups at the gate. Edward and myself were supposed to check the north wedges. The other 3 went south to the cable blocks." Merrick nodded. He had heard this before. "We walked out maybe 100 paces, Garrett continued. "Maybe more. The fog got thicker the farther we went. I could barely hear my own boots. Edward was ahead of me, and I heard him clear as I hear you now. Whistle that 2-note whistle he always used. You know the one. The cattle whistle. Short, high and low. He was checking the wedges, marking them off in his head the way he did. I answered him with my own whistle." "What time?" Merrick asked. 6:30. Maybe 6:45. I wasn't counting time then. I was just trying not to lose him in the fog. "And then?" Garrett's face had gone pale, and then I heard the gate close behind us. Metal on wood, a hard sound. I turned around and I couldn't see the camp anymore, just fog. I called out to Edward that we should head back, that the fog was getting worse. But he didn't answer. I waited. I called again. Nothing. So I started walking back the way we came. I walked, and the fog was so thick I couldn't see my own feet. And then, all of a sudden, the camp was there, the cook fire, the crew. But Edward wasn't with me. He wasn't behind me, he just wasn't there. "Did you hear anything else?" one of the other men asked. His name was Davies. He had worked the mill for 12 years. Garrett looked at his hands. "I heard him whistle again," Garrett said quietly. "After I started walking back, I heard that 2-note whistle, but it was coming from the direction I was walking toward. It was coming from the camp, but when I got back to the camp, nobody had heard it. Nobody had heard him at all. This was the contradiction. This was the thing that made men's necks go tight." Merrick stood up and walked to the edge of the timber yard, where the fog still hung low in the morning air. He looked out toward the open ground where the backward boot prints had ended. "He whistled," Merrick said, "from 2 different directions, at the same time, or near enough." "That's not possible," Davies said. "No," Merrick agreed. "It's not." The search party assembled at 8:30. There were 11 men, including Merrick. They brought lanterns, although it was still technically daylight, thin daylight, filtered through the fog so that everything looked like it was underwater. They brought a dog, a setter named Hook that belonged to the mill owner. They brought coils of rag strips, red and white, to tie to the fence posts and mark the ground they had already walked. They brought shovels and grappling hooks. They brought Catherine Kess because she had insisted, and because no one knew how to tell a wife that you would not search for her husband. Catherine walked at the front with Merrick. She was not crying. She was not speaking. She was just looking at the ground where the backward boot prints had circled the cook fire. "His axe is still clean," she said finally. No one answered her. They moved out past the cook fire into the open ground. The fog was beginning to break slightly, enough that they could see maybe 30 paces in any direction. The men walked shoulder to shoulder, sweeping the area in a line, the way you would sweep for a lost child in a field. Hook the setter walked with them, his nose down, his tail working. For the first 50 paces there was nothing. Crushed grass, scattered stones, the marks of boots from the search that had already happened. Merrick's men were tying rag strips to the fence posts as they went, marking the boundary of the area they had covered. Then Hook stopped. The dog stopped dead in the middle of a patch of low grass, and he began to whine. Not a playful whine, a sound like pain, or like terror. His nose was still down, but his legs had locked rigid. He refused to move forward. "Hook," the mill owner called. His name was Thorne. He was the only man among them who had authority over the dog. "Come on, Hook, find him." But Hook would not move. His whine grew louder, and he lay down flat in the grass, his body pressed against the earth like something was pushing him down from above. One of the younger hands, a boy named Marcus, who had only been working the mill for a few weeks, stepped forward and tried to grab the dog's collar to pull him forward. The moment Marcus touched Hook's collar, the dog began to scream. Not bark. Scream. A sound like an animal does when a trap closes on its leg. "Leave the dog," Merrick said quietly. They left Hook lying in the grass, whining low, his eyes pointing at something beyond the line of the search party. None of the men wanted to look in that direction. None of them wanted to see what the dog was seeing. They continued forward, but the line was broken now. The men were walking closer together, the rag strips marking their territory less like a methodical search and more like a boundary, like a fence around something they were trying to contain. Then one of the men, a worker named Bess, no relation to Edward, called out from 20 paces to the left. "There's another rag strip here," he said, "but we didn't tie it." Merrick walked over. In the low grass, tied around one of the fence posts in a style the men recognized as their own knot, was a rag strip. It was red and white, the same material they had brought with them in the bundle, but none of them remembered tying it. "When did you put that there?" Merrick asked the crew. No one answered. They looked at each other. The strip was old, not fresh. The fabric was slightly faded, and there was a thin line of dirt around where it had been tied, as if it had been sitting there for some time. "That wasn't there an hour ago," Davies said. "I walked past that post. It was bare." The men began to move faster now, less like a search and more like a retreat. They were still moving forward, still calling Edward's name into the fog, but there was an urgency that hadn't been there before. They wanted to find something concrete, a body, a sign, something that made sense so they could go back inside. It was Catherine who heard it first. "Listen," she said, not loud, just one word. The men stopped. In the silence that followed, they all heard it clearly. The two-note whistle, high and low, coming from a direction that shouldn't have had anyone in it, coming from a part of the timber flats that was blank on any map, a place where no fence line stood and no man had any reason to be. "That's him," Catherine said. "That's my Edward." "No," Merrick said, but his voice had no weight. The whistle came again, high and low. It seemed to be moving, circling the search party, the way Edward's backward boot prints had circled the cook fire. The men held their lanterns higher. The fog swallowed the light. "We're going back," Merrick said. "Now, all of us, in a line. We stay together." They walked back the way they had come, but they didn't untie the rag strips. They left them hanging there. Because when they turned around to look, they saw that new rag strips had been tied to posts they had already passed. New ones, red and white, using the same knot, and they were circling in. The search party reached the gate in silence. No one spoke. No one looked back. No one. Catherine was the last one through the gate, and when she turned to close it behind her, she saw that the backward boot prints were still there in the mud by the cook fire. still heel first, still circling where Edward had stood. But now there was something else. Another set of boot prints, fresh ones, was standing at the edge of the open ground where the search party had just been walking. The prints were facing toward the camp, and they had appeared sometime in the last hour, on ground that had already been searched twice and marked with rag strips. "He came back," one of the younger men whispered. "No," Merrick said. "We came back. That's not the same thing." The fog rolled in thicker as the afternoon wore on. By the time dark came, it was impossible to see more than 10 paces in any direction. The men built a fire near the cook fire to keep warm, and they sat around it in a circle, watching the darkness. No one wanted to be alone. No one wanted to turn their back on the timber flats. Catherine sat by the edge of the firelight, still holding the cloth of bread and salt meat that Edward had never eaten. And somewhere in the fog beyond the fence line, someone or something was walking backward in a circle, the way Edward had walked, the way the prints showed he had walked, and the two-note whistle was drifting in and out of the darkness like a sound trying to find its way home. But it never did. By the third day, the search had become something else entirely. It was no longer the frantic work of men trying to find a missing person. It had transformed into a ritual, the way a funeral is a ritual. It had a shape and a rhythm that everyone understood, and no one questioned anymore whether Edward Kess could still be alive. The men of Coos Bay, Oregon, had established a grid. They brought stakes and rope, and they divided the timber flats into squares, each one the length of a man's body times 10. They walked every square in daylight, dragging grappling hooks through the shallow water where the creek ran, marking spots with chalk when they found nothing. By the afternoon of the third day, they had covered 2 miles in both directions from the cook fire. They had found a rusted horseshoe. They had found a leather belt with no buckle. They had found an old shirt so rotted it fell apart when they touched it. But they had not found Edward Kess. The women came during the day and brought food and water. They stood at the edge of the timber yard in their shawls, watching the men work. Catherine came every day. She stood at the same spot and watched the search, and she did not speak to anyone. She had stopped carrying the cloth of bread and salt meat. That was in the box now, in the back room where the light didn't reach. On the night of the fourth day, one of the younger hands, a boy named Thurston, found something lying in the dirt near the fence line where Hook the setter had refused to go. It was a piece of paper, folded twice, sealed with nothing. Thurston brought it to Merrick without opening it. The moment Merrick saw it, he knew. Not because it said anything, because of how it looked. The paper was clean. Too clean. It had been lying in damp grass for days, but there was no dirt on it, no moisture damage, no grass stain. It looked like it had been placed there that morning. Merrick's hands were shaking when he opened it. The handwriting was Edward's. Every man who had worked with Edward Kess recognized it immediately. The letters were precise, small, careful, the kind of handwriting a man uses when he is thinking about every word he is setting down. It said, "Check the wedges on the north line. They are loose. The salt spray is eating them. I will check them myself." It was dated the morning Edward disappeared. It was time-stamped, 6:47 a.m. Edward had been gone since before 7 o'clock. There was silence in the timber yard for a long time. Men stood around Merrick looking at the paper, not touching it. "He couldn't have written this," Davies said finally. "Not after he walked out." "The handwriting is his," Merrick said quietly. "Everyone knows it." "Then he wrote it after he disappeared," one of the other men said. "His name was Holloway. He worked in the mill office. He wrote it and left it for us to find." "From where?" Merrick asked. "From what place? We've walked every inch of this ground." No one could answer. "They locked the note in the mill office. They didn't tell Catherine. They didn't tell the mill owner, Thorne. They kept it among themselves. The way men keep secrets that don't have explanations." But the younger hands began to talk about it in low voices. They began to develop theories. Some said Edward had enemies. There was a man in the next town, a mill boss named Carlyle, who had hired Edward once and then fired him when Edward wouldn't work on Sundays. Maybe Carlyle had come in the night. Maybe he had taken Edward into the timber. But there were no tracks. There were no signs of struggle. And besides, Carlyle had been seen in town that morning, working his own mill. Others said the land out past the thorn fence never gave back what it took. That there were places in the coastal timber that were wrong. Places where men had walked in before and never come back. Places that the older natives wouldn't speak about except in warnings. This theory had the weight of time behind it. Old hands nodded when they heard it. It felt true in the way that old fears always feel true. A few whispered, only whispered, never said aloud where Merrick could hear, that it wasn't a man at all that had brought the cattle through the gate that morning. That something had worn Edward's boots backward and circled the cook fire and left his axe clean for a reason. That something was still walking the timber flats, still waiting. But most of them said nothing at all. They just worked the grid and walked the squares and dragged their hooks and marked their chalk marks, and they went home to their wives in the evening and didn't speak about what they felt moving just past the edge of what they could see. The ritual continued. By the end of the second week, every inch of ground within 3 miles of the cook fire had been walked at least twice. Some areas had been walked 5 times. The men were tired, their hands were blistered, but none of them wanted to be the first to say that the search should end. It was Catherine who finally said it. She came to the timber yard on the morning of the 15th day, and she walked directly to Merrick. She had something in her hands. It was the cloth of bread and salt meat, still wrapped in cloth, still untouched. She had kept it for 2 weeks in the dark room where the light didn't reach. "The bread is going bad," she said. "The meat is rotting. He's not coming back to eat it, so I'm giving it to you, so you can stop looking." Merrick took the cloth from her hands. "Catherine," he said. "He's not lost," she said. "You don't find someone who isn't lost. He walked out in that fog doing his job, and the fog took him, and now we all have to remember that the fog is hungry. That's what's happened. That's what you need to tell people." She walked away before anyone could answer her. That afternoon, the men brought in the rag strips. They untied them from the fence posts and coiled them up. They brought in their stakes and ropes. They stopped dragging the grappling hooks. The search ended, not with a decision, but with a slow acceptance that continued looking, was refusing to admit what had already happened. But the fear didn't end. In fact, it had only just begun. After that night, none of the mill workers would go out alone to check the wedges. 2 men had to go. Always 2. Never 1, and they had to finish their work before the fog came in, which meant they had to rush, and rushing made mistakes. Mistakes meant wedges loosened faster, but no one cared about the wedges anymore. They cared about not being alone. The foreman in the next mill town, a day's walk north, heard what had happened in Coos Bay, Oregon, and he passed the word along to his crew. Don't work the coastal timber alone in the early morning. Don't work it in the fog. If you hear a whistle and no one is there, you don't answer it. You keep walking. The older hands in Coos Bay, Oregon, told the younger ones, you don't go out to check those lines anymore. Not the way Edward did. Not with just 1 man and the fog rolling in. The rule became law without anyone ever formally stating it. On the 21st day after the disappearance, Merrick took the note they had found and burned it in the cook fire. He held it above the flames and watched the handwriting curl and blacken and disappear. When the last of it was ash, he turned to the men standing around the fire. "We don't speak about what was written on that paper," he said. "We don't speak about where it was found. We don't speak about Edward Kess after today. We remember him as a good man who did his job, and we work the timber the way we always have. But we remember what happened, and we teach the new hands. You don't go out alone. You don't go out in the fog. You listen for the whistle and you don't answer it." "And if we hear it anyway?" Davies asked quietly. "Then you keep walking," Merrick said. "You keep walking and you don't look back and you don't answer, because that's not Edward anymore. That's something else that learned to sound like him." No one disagreed. That night the moon was full, and the fog had finally lifted. The timber flats looked clean and empty, the way they looked in the old days before Edward Kess had walked out into the salt air and the thick gray and never come home. But on the edge of the open ground where the search had been centered, where the rag strips had circled and recircled, the men could see something standing still. It looked like a man. It was standing heel first, like someone walking backward. It was standing on ground that had been searched and searched and searched again, and it was perfectly still. No one moved toward it. No one called out. They just watched from around the cook fire, and they waited until the moonlight shifted and the shadow changed shape and what they were seeing became unclear. By morning it was gone, but the axe was gone too. The clean axe that had been leaning against the stump for 3 weeks. Merrick had kept it as evidence, though of what, he couldn't say. When he went to check on it at first light, the stump was empty. The axe was not in the mill office, it was not in the storage shed. It was not anywhere on the mill grounds. What Merrick found instead, placed carefully on the bench outside the foreman's house, was the cloth of bread and salt meat. It was still wrapped in cloth. It was still untouched. But now it was warm. He didn't touch it. He left it on the bench and walked away, and later that morning when he looked again, it was gone. Catherine never asked about it. She had moved away from Coos Bay, Oregon by then. She had taken her stepdaughter and gone north to a place where they didn't know what had happened to Edward Kess. But the story followed her anyway. Stories like this always follow. In Coos Bay, Oregon, men still didn't work the timber alone. The rule had become permanent. Decades would pass, and the rule would remain. The younger generation would inherit it, and they would teach it to their own children the way their fathers had taught it to them. And sometimes, on nights when the fog rolled in off the bay, thick and wet and salt in the throat, men would hear a 2-note whistle coming from the timber flats, and they would grip their companion's shoulders and walk faster, and they would not answer. Because that's what Merrick had said to do, and because everyone understood in a place where something had learned to walk backward in circles, you don't answer back. 40 years after Edward Kess disappeared into the fog off the timber flats near Coos Bay, Oregon, a new foreman named Whitaker arrived to manage the mill. He was young, 25 years old, from inland, from dry country. He didn't know the history. He didn't know the rules. On his first morning, before the sun was up, he told 2 of the newer hands to go out and check the north wedges alone. One of them. He had read in the mill ledger that it was standard practice. Quick job, early shift, 1 man with experience, efficient. The old hand, a man named Garrett who had been working the mill since the day Edward Kess disappeared, stood up and walked directly to Whitaker's office. He didn't knock. "You never send 1 man," Garrett said quietly. "You never send alone to check the north line." Whitaker looked up from his paperwork. "Why not?" he asked. Garrett didn't answer. He just walked back out. But the next morning, he made sure he went with the younger hand anyway. And the morning after that. And every morning for the next 2 weeks until Whitaker stopped giving orders that violated the rule. By the end of the month, Whitaker had figured it out just by watching. New hands always figured it out. They watched the older men and they learned. The rules had teeth even if nobody explained them. The rule spread outward from the mill like rings in water. The mill owner's wife told her friends. The friends told their servants. The servants told the merchants. By the time a full year had passed, everyone in Coos Bay, Oregon, knew that you didn't send a man alone to work the timber before sunrise. Mothers knew it. Children knew it. Parents told their kids not to walk past the timber gate on dark mornings, not even to get to school. The schoolhouse had moved its start time by an hour, pushing classes to begin after sunrise, and no one had ever officially announced why. Years passed, 20 years, 30, 50. The mill changed hands twice. The foreman position cycled through 5 different men. New workers came and went. The younger ones, the ones born after Edward's disappearance, inherited the rule without the story. They knew it the way fish know water. It was just the shape of the world they lived in. Some of them learned the story eventually, usually from an old hand during a quiet evening. Some of them never learned it at all. They just knew. 2 men always, never 1. Before sunrise, move fast. Finish before the fog gets thick. Don't linger in the open ground. The timber gate itself became something almost sacred. It was repaired when it broke, and it was always kept closed except during work hours. Children didn't play near it. Hunters didn't use the timber flats as a shortcut. Dogs wouldn't walk past it, especially in the early morning. Once, a young teacher from back east came to Coos Bay and decided to walk into the timber flats for a nature study with some of her older students. It was mid-morning. It was clear weather. The sun was fully up. The townspeople watched her go, and they said nothing, because she had the right to go. But they all waited for her to come back, and when she did come back 3 hours later, she was alone. The students had refused to go further than the first gate. They had sat down in the grass and would not move. She had had to come back and collect them, apologizing, not understanding what she had done wrong. She taught in Coos Bay for 1 more year and then she left. She never explained to anyone why, but everyone understood. The physical mark on the land had changed. The timber flats were still worked, that was business, and business couldn't stop for fear. But no one built permanent structures there anymore. No shelters were erected. No supply caches were left overnight. The mill moved its equipment in at sunrise and moved it out before sunset. If a tool broke, they left it. If a man got injured, they carried him out immediately. The timber flats were functional space, nothing more. You worked it, and then you left it. The road that passed by the timber gate was gradually widened and rerouted. It took 15 years, but eventually a new path was cut that didn't go directly past the gate. Children could take the new road to school without passing the timber flats at all. Merchants used it. Travelers used it. By 1945, 50 years after Edward Kess had walked out into the fog, most people in Coos Bay, Oregon, didn't even think about the old road anymore. But some people did. The oldest people, the ones who had known Edward, the ones who had been part of the original search. They didn't come to the mill anymore. They were retired, or they had moved away, or they were dead. But the story lived in them, and they passed it down the way people pass down prayers or warnings. Garrett lived to be 93 years old. Before he died, he spent a winter telling the story to his grandson, a boy named Michael, who was thinking about working at the mill. He told him about Edward Kess. He told him about the backward boot prints. He told him about the note that had appeared where nothing had been found. He told him about the whistle. And then he told him something else. "The thing is," Garrett said, "there's different ways to understand what happened, and every one of them is true depending on how you look at it." Michael asked what he meant. "One way is that Edward Kess had enemies, and someone came in the night and killed him and buried him somewhere we never found. That's a human explanation, and it makes sense. Men do things like that." Garrett paused. "Another way is that Edward walked out to check the wedges, and he fell, or he got lost in the fog, and he wandered off the path and into a ravine or into the water, and the current took him out into the bay. That's a natural explanation. It happens. Men die doing their jobs." Another pause. Longer this time. "But there's a third way," Garrett said quietly, "and nobody in Coos Bay, Oregon says this out loud. But they think it. You can see it in the way they won't work the timber alone. You can see it in how the town moved the road. The third way is that something took him. Something that walks backward. Something that learned to sound like a whistle and learned to write in his handwriting. And something that isn't done with him yet. Isn't done with us. And that's why we have the rule. That's why we'll always have the rule." Michael asked which version was true. Garrett looked at his grandson for a long time before answering. "The one that stops us from going back out there alone," he said. "That's the one that's true. The others are just the stories we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night." Garrett died 3 months later. Michael took a job at the mill and he followed the rule. He taught it to the newer hands, and the rule held, the way rules do when they're built on something that nobody can explain but everybody believes. By the end of the 20th century, the story of Edward Kess had taken on the texture of legend. The people who had known him were dead. The people who had been part of the original search were dead. The mill had changed. The equipment had changed. The forest itself had changed, with different trees growing in where the old timber had been cut. But the rule remained, and sometimes on mornings when the fog rolled in off the bay thick and salt-heavy, and the light was still gray, the men who went out to work the timber would move faster than necessary. They would do their job and come back through the gate, and they would not speak about what they thought they had heard in the fog. A 2-note whistle, footsteps moving in the wrong direction, The sound of something that walked backward, still looking for the place where it had stopped all those years ago. People in Coos Bay, Oregon, still don't work the timber alone before sunrise. The rule has been passed down so many times that it has become law without anyone ever writing it as law. New hands hear it from old hands. Wives hear it from mothers. Children hear it from their parents the same way children have always heard warnings about places where you don't go alone. And if you ask anyone in Coos Bay why the rule exists, you'll get 3 different answers, and none of them will be the same. Some will tell you it's because of an accident that happened 100 years ago. Some will tell you it's because of a man who was killed by someone nobody could prove was guilty. Some will look at you for a long time, and they won't answer at all, but they'll make sure they never work that timber alone. And they'll make sure their children know the rule, and they'll mark the spot in their minds as a place where something happened that doesn't have an explanation that sits right in the daylight. The question is not which story is true. The question is which version makes sense here, the human one, the natural one, or the impossible one, and which version nobody in Coos Bay, Oregon, dares to say out loud, because the ones who saw it are gone. The ones who heard the whistle are gone. But the fear they left behind is still walking backward on the timber flats when the fog comes in, and the rule still holds. And every new generation of workers learns it without needing to know why. That's what the old men still say. That's what they still teach. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.